Hello, my name is Olivia King. I am Manager of Research Capability Building with Western Alliance. Welcome to this STaRR resource all about qualitative data analysis, where I'll be providing a bit of an introduction for you. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which I am working and living on today, the Wadawurrung people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to the elders, both past and present, and extend my acknowledgement and respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people tuning into this clip. I'd like to thank Dr. Ella Autry and Alicia Sainer, who have contributed to this resource also. Right, so before I get too far in, I've got a few disclaimers. So this resource is for emerging researchers who are using qualitative or mixed methods approaches to address their defined research question. This clip and the resources are pitched at a level that assumes that you have either attended the STaRR Emerging Researcher training or have otherwise learned the basics of research design and the role of qualitative health research. It is also assumed that you are either currently developing your protocol and are ready to plan your data analysis section, or you have already collected your qualitative data and need some practical guidance on how to approach the analysis. Now, if you've already done some preliminary reading, you will know that there is a huge body of literature on qualitative research and analysis, and some conflicting information therein, which may have left you feeling a little bit confused. There are many different approaches to qualitative data analysis, many of which have prescribed steps, but there is no single or linear pathway for qualitative data analysis. So the aim of this session is to provide some guidance on the key considerations when planning and conducting your qualitative data analysis. And by the end of this clip, I anticipate that you will be able to describe the purpose of qualitative data analysis in health and health services research, identify the key considerations when selecting a qualitative data analysis approach, describe 4 common approaches to analysing qualitative data, and identify some commonly used tools to support qualitative data analysis. So qualitative data comes in many forms. The content of this resource, though, relates to the analysis of textual data. That is, text that has been transcribed from interviews or focus groups or gathered via open-ended survey questions. Existing documents may also be analysed qualitatively, such as health policies, procedures, or guidelines. So qualitative data analysis is the process of categorising data conceptually to identify patterns of meaning within and across a data set. By analysing qualitative data, researchers aim to generate new concepts known as themes from the data, or identify the alignment between the new data and existing theory. Qualitative data analysis is an inherently subjective process, as researchers analyse the data gathered with respect to their own experiences and understanding of the world and existing theories. It can also be a messy and non-linear process with lots of backwards and forwardsing. So there are a few key terms that I'd just like to define before I continue on. A theme is an interpretive concept that explains a proportion of the data collected. Thematic analysis is the general method that is used to identify and describe patterns or themes within and across a data set. Now, the term code comes up but has 2 slightly different meanings. One, code the verb, is the process of indexing, label, or categorizing the data. Code the noun is a label or short phrase that denotes an interesting or relevant concept. They are the smaller components of themes. Inductive coding is where the researcher generates the themes from the data itself, that is, from the bottom up. Deductive coding is where the researcher identifies an existing theory, framework, or themes and codes a priori, that is, before the analysis, which are then used to code the data from top down. Abductive coding is where the researcher moves between the data and an existing or a priori theory or framework, which is applied to the data set flexibly and developed and redeveloped through the coding process. Reflexivity, which I'll talk about a little bit more, is a set of continuous, collaborative, and multifaceted practices through which researchers self-consciously critique, appraise, and evaluate how their subjectivity and context influences the research process and processes. A theory is an abstract description of the relationship between concepts that helps us to understand the world. And finally, a transcript is data that has been converted from spoken into written form. So when planning qualitative data analysis, it's really important that, that you are aware that there are many different qualitative data analysis methods described in the literature. And I must emphasize that there is no hierarchy or universally agreed upon superior approach, but rather there are different analysis methods that suit different research aims, questions, data collection methods, and types and volumes of data. It is important that the approach to qualitative data analysis aligns with the aims of the research and the data collection methods. This alignment, or internal coherence, is a key marker of rigor in qualitative research. Now, for more on internal coherence, there is a great paper by Palermo and colleagues, which you will find in the reference section of this resource, and also in the reference section that contains a comprehensive list below. So to ensure the rigor of your qualitative research, it is important to identify and follow an established, structured approach to analysis before you begin. So here are some quick key questions for you to consider as you select an appropriate approach. Firstly, what are the aims of your research? For example, is it to describe, summarize, or even quantify your qualitative data? Or is it to infer new meaning or even develop a new theory? Or is it somewhere in between? Will you use an existing theory or framework to guide your analysis? Or will you develop codes and themes from the data itself? How much data do you have? Pages and pages of interview transcripts, or 10 short open text survey responses? Will you be analysing the data alone, or will you have multiple researchers involved? Finally, how much time or capacity do you have to dedicate to data analysis? All of these, the answers to these questions will inform what approach you take. Now, I mentioned that there are many different approaches. I have selected 4 to discuss today, and these are 4 commonly used approaches that we see in health services and clinician-led qualitative research. Firstly, we have reflexive thematic analysis, framework analysis, template analysis, and content analysis. So let's start with Brown and Clark's reflexive thematic analysis. This is a commonly cited approach to qualitative data analysis, but is not always well understood or used appropriately. Reflexive TA, as I'll refer to it from here on in, is a flexible approach that enables a deeper level of interpretation of qualitative data. In reflexive TA, researchers' subjectivity is central to the process, meaning their role in analysing the data is given equal status to the research question and the data itself. This also means that reflexive TA is absolutely central to the research process and cannot be outsourced to a research assistant, for example. There are some cases where it's really ideal to use reflexive TA, and these include where the research question or aims require a greater depth of analysis and interpretation, and where the researcher has both the capacity and capability to immerse themselves in the data and develop themes. This is really quite a resource and labour-intensive process. An example of where reflexive TA can be really useful is if a research project was exploring new graduates' experiences of professional identity. So what does reflexive TA look like? There are 6 steps that researchers move through, and I need to emphasize iteratively. This is not a defined step-by-step pathway that you can't move backwards and forwards in. The first step, though, invariably is familiarization. This is where, as the researcher, you will read transcripts and or listen to the audio recordings. You'll generate the initial codes, systematically organizing data under the relevant codes. You then begin to search for the themes, and to do this, you arrange the individual codes that have shared meaning into potential themes. So this is where you start to really think about grouping and making sense of groups of data. You'll then review and develop the themes with relevant data and check if it all works and makes sense. And this is where you begin to develop a thematic map. And this is where the next step is where you define and name the theme. So this is where, based on the thematic map, you can begin to clearly define the themes and what they mean. The 6th step then is producing the report. And this is where you go about writing up the story. I won't focus on report or manuscript writing in this resource. So just to reiterate, you don't need to follow these steps from top to bottom. It is an iterative process, and reflexivity is at the center of this type of analysis. Researchers bring their subjectivities and unique interpretations of the data. Attending to and maintaining reflexive awareness is crucial. So do refer to the definition of reflexivity and the resources in the end all about reflexivity. The next approach I'd like to talk about is framework analysis, which represents a more structured approach to data analysis, in which a framework or code book is produced and then used systematically to code all of the data. A new analytical framework can be developed from the data itself, that is inductively, or a pre-existing a priori framework or code book can be used. That is a deductive approach. The framework method can also be used to adapt and build on an existing theory or framework through iterative coding and analysis. This is called an abductive approach. In any case, the coding framework needs to be detailed, including definitions of codes and example data. The framework method is best suited to health practice and policy research, and in research projects where there will be multiple people coding the data, as they can utilize the framework to enable some consistency in that approach. An example of where the framework method would be really ideal is if research was exploring rural health staff experiences of utilizing mental health and wellbeing supports in their workplaces, with a view to influence the supports available in their local and state level rural health worker wellbeing policy. So a really applied research project. Gail and colleagues developed a useful step-by-step guide, which is included in the reference sections at the end of this clip and in the resource section. So there are 7 steps to the framework approach. The first is transcribing the data. This can be outsourced or can be done by the researcher themselves. If done by the researcher themselves, this really leads nicely into the second stage, which is familiarization. This is where, again, you reread the transcripts and or listen to audio recordings. The next step is initial coding of a portion of the transcripts. So if it is a larger qualitative study, you might develop the initial coding on approximately 25% of the data. If it's a smaller scale study and say you only have 3 transcripts, you might develop the initial coding framework based on all of the data. This feeds into step 4, which is where you identify an initial thematic framework, or the developing the initial coding framework. Step 5 is then applying that framework to all of the data. Through that process, you might revisit the framework and adapt that according to new data and codes that are coming out. The next step is charting. This is where you decipher patterns in the data and start to think about what this means. What story is it telling you? And finally, the step 7 is mapping and interpreting the data. And this is where you consider the data and the themes in the context of what's already known in the existing literature. The third approach I'd like to talk about is template analysis, which is a hierarchical approach to analysis with higher level and sub-themes. It's quite similar to the framework method, which I've just spoken about. However, a key difference here is the greater focus on developing the coding template. And there is less guidance around the interpretation and mapping of the data. Template analysis is flexible regarding the style and the format of the template that is produced. And it's important to note that there is so much focus on developing and redeveloping the template that this is sometimes mistaken as the output of the process, rather than the output being the actual data and synthesis of that. Now, similar to the framework approach, this template analysis is best suited to applied health research when there is a predefined or a priori theory guiding the research process. It's also useful for team-based analyses, as all team members can contribute to the development of the template and to the structured coding process. And an example here might be researchers could use the template approach to analyze data collected from health professionals about their perceived barriers and enablers to integrating mental health screening into their clients' assessments. In this case, the theoretical domains framework, which is a behavior change theory, could be used as the template to code the data. Nigel King is a well-known proponent of this type of thematic analysis. And once again, there are the resources are captured at the end of this clip. So there are 6 steps to a template analysis, and the first, and you'll see that this is common across all of the approaches, is to become familiar with the data. Similar to framework analysis, if it's a small study, you'll familiarize yourself with all of the data, but in a larger study, you might only familiarize yourself with a subset of the data, 20 to 30%, for example. The next step is to carry out preliminary coding of the data, highlighting any interesting or recurring observations in the data, plus some a priori themes, which you might be applying. You then organize emerging themes into clusters and begin to define how they relate to each other within and across these. This leads into defining an initial coding template. This is where you can use a subset of the data or all of the data. You then apply the initial template to further data and code and organize that, modifying the template as appropriate. Once the template is final, this is where you apply this more finally to the full data set. The fourth and final approach I will be talking about is content analysis. It's another commonly used approach in health services research. It can be an inductive process, and this is called conventional content analysis, or a deductive process, which is also called directed content analysis. There is a third approach that is known as summative content analysis, which is a more quantitative form of analysis and involves counting the number of times a word, term, or phrase is used within a data set. Further, latent analysis can be conducted to explore the meaning of words in a particular context. And I'm going to use an example that's different to that listed on the slide here. It could be the use of the term risk in aged care policies and procedures. So occasions where it's useful to use content analysis is when analysing open text survey data, which are typically very short responses. For analysing data that is collected in line with a predetermined framework. And I've got the COM-B, which is another behaviour change theory listed on the slide here. for analysing policies and procedures, and for quantifying qualitative data. That is, if you want to know how frequently a term is used in a particular context. So depending on whether you are using a conventional inductive or directed deductive approach, these steps are slightly different. So for a conventional approach, as with all of the others, the first step is to immerse yourself by reading and rereading the data. The second step is to open code the data. This is where you identify and highlight keywords or concepts. You then move on to making an initial analysis. This is where you make notes and impressions of your thoughts, and you start to relabel the codes based on these thoughts and impressions. You then categorize the codes, that is, organizing and grouping these into meaningful clusters, the beginning of the themes, and hierarchies. And you also define the codes and the themes. Finally, you produce the report, both of the analysis process and the results. If taking a more deductive approach, again, you start by reading the data, then identifying and defining existing theory or a priori themes and codes. You then apply that theory or the codes to the data. And you can also, in this approach, generate new codes for data that do not fit. And finally, moving on to reporting the process and the results. So those are the 4 commonly used approaches. I'm now briefly going to talk about some tools and software that can be used to support qualitative data analysis. There are 4 commonly used software packages: NVivo, Atlas TI, Cactus or Max QDA, and finally Deduce. Actually, not finally, there are many more. These are just 4 that I've chosen to mention on this slide. Now, these tools can be really useful for researchers to code and organize qualitative data. However, it's important that you know they don't do the work for you. They are simply tools. Also, for many of us working in health services, we may not have access to these tools. Researchers affiliated with universities are a lot more likely to have access. If you are interested in using qualitative data analysis software, I do encourage you to speak with your research translation coordinator because you may well be able to have access. That all said, many qualitative researchers use simple tools that all of us will have access to, such as Microsoft Word and using tables in there, or Excel. Spreadsheets can be really useful to organize qualitative data. Others use mind mapping tools, but it's really important to note there are no hard and fast rules about what tools should be used. It often comes down to what you have access to, what you're comfortable with, and what you prefer. I will say this, using NVivo, Atlas TI, or any of the others does take a little bit of skill. They're not necessarily intuitive programs, so do factor that in if you decide that you want to use software. All right. You may have some more questions, so please feel free to contact me via starsupport@deakin.edu.au. I'm really keen to get your feedback. You'll find that there is a survey link embedded in all of the resources, so please do provide any feedback. If you've got some questions more specifically about your project, you can access your mentor if you have one, or your research translation coordinator. And on the next slide, I'll have a full list of readings and resources, but these are also captured within the resource itself. And please stay tuned for more qualitative health research resources. Thank you.